Well, good morning, bore da. Welcome to Children and Young People. Croeso I cyfarfod plant a pobl ifanc. I'm Tudor Thomas. I'm Chair of Children and Young People and Ward Member in Abergavenny. We are somewhat spread out this morning if you're watching on live stream. But that is obviously due to the circumstances that we're currently operating under. I'm certainly very grateful today to members and officers for turning up, as I say, in somewhat challenging circumstances. We'll do some introductions and then we'll go into the main agenda. I say, I'm Tudor Thomas, Chair of the committee.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance, here in a scrutiny capacity today.
Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People.
Councillor Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Councillor Jo Watkins, Caldecott Castle Ward and a member of this committee.
Councillor Louise Brown, Shire Newton Ward and a member of this committee.
Right, thank you. We'll now go to the formal agenda. And we'll take item number 1, apologies for absence. If Matt could...
Yeah. Chair, we have apologies from Councillors Martin Grocott, David Jones, Laura Jones, Malcolm Lane, and also apologies from co-opted governors Elizabeth Thomas, Peter Strong, and Mrs Maggie Harris.
Thanks. We'll now go to any declarations of interest. As you know, if they arise, obviously, you know, let me know. Item 3, public open forum. Then there is nothing that I'm aware of for today's meeting. So we move now. Then we go into the Chief Officer report from the Chief Officer, obviously Will McLean.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to a draft version of the Chief Officer's report for 2019-20. It's probably, I think it'd be fair to say before I go into the main meat of the presentation, it is actually this year a draft version. So you're seeing a version which will change by the time we get to full council. That is working on the premise that full council does take place on the 2nd of April. But this was an opportunity for you to reflect on some of the things which are in the report and for me to shape how I take it through to council because of some of the changes which we're experiencing in Wales with regards to some of our reporting. So in terms of what I intend to cover off, to reflect on the purpose and the context of where we are, some Chief Officer's reflections. One area which is as yet underdeveloped is around the progress against 17-18's priority areas. Now, the reason for that is because some of those were very clear performance-related matters, but how we report on performance has now changed significantly from previous years. So that's the areas which I just want to work through. To touch on the reforms that are still playing out, although you know, the timeline for those reforms is very tight, and we will wait and see now what happens in light of the COVID-19 challenges we're facing at the moment. To look at the data we do have around student outcomes. Now, there's a significant amount of data within this report still, and it would be good to have reflections from members of the committee whether there is too much, whether they've seen it before, whether there should be less, or how that might be presented. I will reflect on attendance and exclusions. And again, the broader work part is again one which is probably something which will bring in for full council, which will hopefully expand some of those areas. Finances we'll touch on in terms of where are the schools, and we'll also touch on leadership as well. And then I'll offer some conclusions before taking questions, if that's okay. So the purpose of the report is to inform council of the progress the education system has made in the past 12 months. That does include looking at examination and assessment period that ends in August 2019. And really just kind of that paragraph there picks up one of the key issues. It's that lack of aggregation. And it's both, and that works at two levels. There's a lack of aggregation to a county level, and there's a lack of aggregation to a level which is based on consolidated indicators as well. So whereas in the past, for instance, we'd have looked at the foundation phase indicators, which is a combination of literacy, numeracy, and personal social development, we're no longer aggregating those indicators. So lots of the language which we've used in the past, we can't use anymore, and you'll see that as we go through. But the report really does seek to give you an assurance around the direction of travel, and hopefully by the time we come back together at council, that will be in greater depth than the current version is. But also in the relatively near future, there'll be a publication IN's report following their core inspection of the authority, which took place in the middle of February as well. So there will be, before the end of April, another 2 significant opportunities for members to take a level of assurance the system is and where the authority is in terms of its work. And the other point there, and you'll forgive just me checking the dates in red, that you as a select committee have had 2 detailed reports around outcomes at Key Stage 4 and foundation phase to Key Stage 3 in the past. Sorry. So the first thing just to touch on, why are we here? So what's our purpose as a directorate and how do we do it? And really, this is just to kind of remind members about the kind of the framework which we're working in. So clearly we have our organisational purpose, which is building sustainable and resilient communities. Within the wellbeing plan, our contribution is to provide children and young people with the best possible start in life. And within our own corporate plan, it's around the best possible start in life. So it's very clear where our contribution to that kind of core overarching purpose is. And how do we see that and how does that manifest itself? Well, clearly the Chief Officer's report that I'm talking to today is a fundamental part of that, as is the AS business plan, which is really the kind of the slew of activity that works in our schools and is provided by the AS, who are our absolutely key partner in how we do this. And then finally, there are our service improvement plans that capture the real detail of the actions that are being worked through by my teams and their teams. And that really sets out the detail, the risk assessments and the evaluation and the impact. And those service improvement plans are available for any member to look at any time. They're all available on the hub, and people can have a look at those. And if there are more detailed questions that members have, then they can be drawn out and I will pick those up. So in the last couple of years, we've had kind of questions about the shape of Monmouthshire in terms of our provision and in terms of what our school population looks like and so on and where that is. So hopefully this the map on the left-hand side of that slide just kind of gives a sense about where the schools are. The red markers indicate secondary schools. The smaller purple markers indicate our primaries. And you can see then on the right-hand side, I guess people know that there are 30 primary schools, 4 secondaries. We have 1 special school, although that will be closing in August of this year. We have our PRU, but we also have 12 maintained nurseries in our schools and 20 non-maintained settings. And that's more of a mixed economy in Monmouthshire than you'll find in many other counties in terms of that early years provision. And you'll also see at the top there that we have roughly, nearly 6,500 primary school children, nearly 5,000 secondary. We have 15 children in special schools, or our special school, at the time we wrote this, and 15 children who are on the roll of the PRU exclusively. And then down at the bottom there, the number of staff, 165 or 99 internal. That includes all of the kind of the substantive grant-funded packages, so things like Flying Start, the Acorn Centre, all of those teams are included in there. I was surprised when I saw that number as well. Then you'll see there as well that nearly 2,000 school-based staff, but really just over 1,000 full-time equivalents working in those schools. So that's the kind of the scale. The other thing which I thought it would be useful to do this year was just to show our school population. So this is PLAS 2020. So these numbers are our most recently collected. So this is January this year. And you can see there that that's just split into male and female, but gives a sense around where we are in that kind of school modelling. So you can see at the moment that our secondary schools are lower, and we've got this this higher level of cohorts coming through in the future years. So years reception through to 6 are higher than 7 through to 11. Now, some of that is because we lose children to other schools, and that's something which has been well rehearsed through our corporate plan, and realistically is significantly about the nature of the county as well. If I jump back up to the last slide, if we think about Abergavenny, there is another secondary school 5 miles down the road, literally just beyond the border there, in Crickhowell. Equally in Monmouth, there's a school within 3 miles on the other side of the border, and in Chepstow, Wydene is even closer. And then obviously there's not very far between Chepstow and Caldecott itself in the south. So, but those three in particular really do present that challenge of children leaving our system and going to other schools. So that contributes to some of the fall off in terms of population looks like. The other slide, which I think we'll need a bit more detail on it before it comes back to full council, but this is really just to members a sense about the ALN profile that exists within the county. That's simply picking up those without any additional learning needs, which is the blue, and then those on School Action Plus, and those statemented. And that's what those are, referring. No, that's fine. Yeah, and as I looked at it, I suddenly realised. So yes, absolutely, we'll make sure that's clearer. If people would prefer a kind of bars rather than the stack graph, we can do that as well. And I'm happy to take that feedback from members either in the session today or outside this meeting. That's no problems at all. So that's what our population looks like, and those are the people and the children and people we're trying to give the best possible start in life to. So last year when I presented my report, I made the point that actually it was a difficult report to write because in some respects, performance wasn't where we'd hoped it would have been in 2018. And that was a challenge for us. We knew we wanted our schools to do better. Now, this is my 4th Chief Officer's report, but in many ways, actually coming to write this was actually really very difficult, simply because some of the key metrics and so on that we've had for a long time, and I think if I look back, I was involved first in education on the publication of the report, which took us into special measures in 2013. Lots of those key metrics have now been moved on by Welsh Government, and I think rightly so, and I agree entirely with the direction of travel. But it does mean that some of the common language which we've established Chamber and elsewhere is no longer available to us. And so that's one of the things which is been challenging in some regards. So just picks up in 1920, we've had to recast our reporting of school performance and how we provide assurance to you as members and our broader stakeholders. Now I recognise that for some this might be an erosion of accountability, but it really does allow schools to focus on progress, and it really does allow schools to focus on improving rather than thinking about what can they do to improve specific indicators. And that's really what we want to see. And interestingly, it's been, if Steve Davis, who's the Education Director for Wales, has reflected in the past, when you look at foundation phase, for instance, we've seen foundation phase outcomes drop in Monmouthshire in the last couple of years, and that's been seen right across Wales, that decline, and that is because of the people no longer publishing. So people are no longer publishing and continuing to try and keep very high levels. So that's had a real impact straight away. The other significant part there is earlier this year, in 2020, we saw the revised guidance for the new curriculum for Wales. Really, really significant, a purpose-led curriculum, 4 key purposes, 6 areas of learning and experience. All of our language will have to change and update significantly when we think about curriculum. when we think about how our young people achieve, when we think about when our young people achieve. Really, really significant national debate. And I'm very fortunate in that at the moment I'm the lead director for the South East Wales region, which means I get to participate in those debates and discussions with Welsh Government and our other partners. And that's really kind of giving us a good insight about that direction of travel and so on. And I think that just picks up on that final paragraph there. You know, we are part of a key middle tier, as it's been referred to, and it's really, really important that that middle tier, which is basically the local authorities, the consortia, so the AS in our case, but then other actors such as Estyn, the Education Workforce Council, WJ, Quals Wales, really work together to make a success of the changes that are coming down the line. So I think where we got to in 1920 was that we reached some really important stepping stones in terms of our ability to give assurance about where our school system was. In a whole range of measures across all of our schools, we've seen significant improvement, and we've seen sustained high performance in many of our schools. And many of our schools are on a secured and continuous improvement journey. The authority has got a strong track record in moving schools through the schools causing concern process. So that's the regionally agreed approach to how we work with schools that are either amber or red to make sure that they improve. The outcomes of our Estyn inspections are improving. Now there's a plus and a minus to that one. So where we are now is that for the last handful of schools that have been inspected in this new inspection framework, we've moved from a position whereby the outcome which we saw most commonly in Monmouthshire was a mixture of adequates and goods, to now being 5 goods being the most common outcome in terms of our outcomes from Estyn inspection, which I think is really positive. The flip side to that, and the continuing challenge, is that we still see too few excellent judgments in terms of our schools. And I am entirely aware of that, as is the executive member, as are our schools. And that's really important, that our schools also recognise that that lack of excellence, especially for standards, is a key area of concern for the organisation, for the authority, and I think really reflects our level of expectation upon our teachers and our schools. We have seen successful development of cluster working, promoting a collective responsibility for learners. I think they're really important that we retain in our minds that notion that actually we really need to think about a child's education as a continuum from when they start school. It's not all about the secondary school delivering GCSEs. You know, if I talk to secondary head teachers, they'll be very clear that actually their ability to succeed is actually premised on children having great skills when they start in year 7. So that's really important. We have a relationship with the region which is now strengthened and closer than ever. And I think that's really, really important as to how we make progress. And we're beginning to see our schools become self-sustaining in supporting their own leadership and their own development. We've seen the emergence of significant grant funding through Welsh Government, through the AS, to promote that, and I think that's really important. And finally, I think a key metric for me, really, is that our school leaders are now contributing to school leadership across the region, and we are a contributor to supporting other schools rather than being a recipient of support from other schools outside of the county. So in 2 cases now, in Ysgol Thyn, in Caldecott, Mr Hallett is now supporting 2 schools in Caerphilly, and as of Monday, properly, but agreed by her full governing body last week, Mrs Lewis from King Henry VIII is now the executive head teacher at Crossy Ceiliog, a school that's in special measures in Torfaen. So I think that really represents, you know, how our leadership standards and expectations have risen over that period of time. Really important for us is that we're seeing more of our children attend schools, and, you know, children, that's a really key proxy for us in terms of children attending school, and being ready to learn is a key one, and we continue to perform very well there. I've got lessons learnt here. and this is, and I talked at the beginning around how I'm framing our progress towards last year's areas of focus. And this is just my reflection, I guess, for us as we work in performance and so on, is that I think when we looked at the areas of focus for last year, they were too vague and potentially too wide to be useful for us in providing really kind of tailored tracking as to the impact. And in education and in terms of ESTIN and so on, the key piece is always about understanding the impact that your activity has had. And they gave areas of focus, but they were not at the level of specificity that we would have hoped for. So in the 2021 document, when it's completed, you will see that the measures which we propose for next year's will be, as the government has just launched in some of its documentation, this notion around C-SMART. So SMART is as was, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-bound. The C is challenging. So we retain that challenge to the piece, which I think is really important, gives us that stretch, but actually we do maintain those important components of definition of the areas of focus into the future. So the next slide now picks up on understanding of performance of our schools. So I'm not going to read this out, but and you'll have had this several times before. This is in the documentation that the AS have provided, and this was the letter that was received by cabinet members, chairs of scrutiny, directors of education, chief execs, and the regional consortia. And this was, collectively, we have agreed that this is the right approach to take and strongly advise you to use a broad range of unaggregated data. And that's the key point, really. Now, one thing, just to be entirely open, because of, I guess, statutory requirements, Welsh Government did end up publishing some aggregated data in the relatively recent past. But in the spirit of the letter and so on, I haven't gone back and used that. They had to do that for another requirement within Welsh Government, but really it was never the intention for that to be used in educational settings and for comparative reasons, so I haven't used that here. But if you were to Google that, you'd find it, and it's got kind of how local authorities perform and so on. But we've stuck to the spirit and the advice that that the Welsh Government and WLGA agreed. So the next set of slides really kind of pick up presentations that you've previously had in terms of outcomes, but they're here because there'll be 4 or 5 of you which will have received this information, but many members won't have by the time we get to the 2nd of April, and in terms of how we feed back. So the first couple of slides I've kind of annotated just for the benefit of other members, really, to kind of think about what's important and what's right and what is good. So on the 2 graphs, 2 scatter graphs, you'll see the orange dots are Monmouthshire schools, the grey dots are the rest of the schools in the AS region. And all I've done here is just to highlight those schools which are of specific concern or have achieved well. So if you look at the right-hand side there, you'll see a school that has probably eligibility of about 36% for free school meals. And in terms of its attainment at outcome 5 for language, literacy and communication at foundation phase, so this is assessed at the end of year 2, you can see that that school there has achieved significantly above the line of regression in terms of the achievement of that population. So that's a really good one. So I've highlighted that in green. Elsewhere, though, if you come across one, you'll see that single school identified with 20% of FSM entitlement has achieved significantly below where we'd expect that to be. So you can see there that they're achieving just probably above 50-odd%, and the line is much closer up towards 80 or 90%. So that's why that one's highlighted. And then at the other, on the left-hand side there, we've just selected those schools with very, very low levels of FSM entitlement who are below the line in terms of their achievement. And the same on the one beneath. Now, the one beneath picks up outcome 6, so this is the expected level plus 1. So whilst I wouldn't probably go quite so far as to say that these are kind of math children, but these are definitely children who are above the average in terms of their performance. You can see there that highlighted in green are the ones above the line, but then there is this group highlighted in red who sit below the line, and I think that's important. So that's what we've just tried to do. So that's, again, just helping you as hopefully as members just understand what you're looking for in those. There's a slight piece of narrative on the right-hand side there that just sets out where we are in terms of outcomes 5 and outcomes 6. And you can see that outcome 5 was slightly above the region as a whole. Overall, at outcome 6, we're in line with the region as a whole in terms of our position. So in terms of your time this morning, and wanting to make sure we make best use of that time, there are, I think, 9 slides in this section of the report that pick up so LLC, language, literacy and communication. The next slide does exactly the same, but picks up mathematical development at outcome 5 and 6. The next one picks up personal and social development. Do you want to ask questions at this point around the foundation phase, Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3? Or do you want me to keep going through them? Or I don't mind. How do you want to do that?
What do members feel? Because some of this is so detailed, might it be better to do it as we go, in a sense, rather than trying to dip right back?
Yeah.
Absolutely fine. Okay.
Councillor Watkins.
Just then, a couple of things in terms of the presentation of the material, especially when you're talking about going to full council. Yeah. So obviously we've seen these graphs before. Yeah, I also have a stats background, so I don't find them complicated, but members might find them quite challenging. Just to point out on the actual presentation of the graph, I didn't know that it said outcome 5 or above because of the fact that there's an overtype. Oh, okay. I couldn't actually read what the difference was between the two graphs to begin with. So just presentationally, that will need to be fixed. And then you might need, I think members are going to need some extra input as you go through them in terms of how it actually, just for presentation purposes. We have seen them from EAS before. So.
I thank you for that, Councillor Watkins. I think what I didn't want to do, so the slide deck at the moment runs to 38 slides. What I didn't want to do was to go for a slide a deck or slide a page, and then suddenly we're up to kind of, I think we're up to 18 additional, so another 9 slides, unless, we could do that quite easily. And if we were to do that, it could just be that I don't present it in the same level of detail and just take questions, or maybe even put it as an appendix. That might be something which we think about doing, and just retain the key message and the narrative around what's been achieved. Okay, that's fine.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if I could go back to slide 5, 6 and 7. On slide 5, it's about shape our place. And there's some details there. It says, I presume it's really use of mnemonics, and I presume SN is special needs, but I'm not sure what RBS is. In terms of numbers of pupils. Can you see under pupils? Yeah. In brackets, there's 39.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Special needs resource base. Yes.
Yeah, because obviously if you don't and in terms of staff where it says internal, is that internal in the schools or is that internal for Monmouthshire County Council?
That's for Monmouthshire County Council.
Yeah, because again, I think it would be helpful. And then the next slide, which is age and gender. I'm not sure. Obviously, male and female is understandable, but I don't know what N1 to 13 means in the chart. And then on number 7, again, explaining what N1, N2 and the whole thing to 13. I mean, this could be key stages, I'm not sure. But then down the side it says PASN. And again, if we have an explanation of what that means, I think the assumption is that if there's any mnemonics there, it's helpful if in brackets you put what the mnemonics mean. And it was the same thing, I think, on the slide that, obviously you've got, obviously I understand FSM and things like that, but like C Smart, you gave a definition of that when you went through the thing. but in brackets, it would be helpful if you could say what that actually means. And I know when you become very familiar with terms, you think because you know them, everybody else does. But often that's not the case. So it then means that we've got charts here that people don't necessarily understand what they actually mean. Thank you.
No, that's very fair. So the M and the F is obviously male-female on this one. So then that's N1 and N2 is nursery 1, nursery 2. R is reception, and then it's your curriculum years 1 to 13. So year 1 through to year 13, which is upper 6th. And the ALN one, which I think I said in the way through, is no special needs, statement, school action plus. But I'll get those expanded out, and we'll have a. And the other thing is, it's probably worthwhile putting in a list of the often used phrases and so on, which we can do that. That's no problem.
Yeah, so what's PLAS?
P is school action plus. A is school action.
Oh, I see at the top it says PLASC. Sorry.
PLASC is the pupil level audit that takes place every January. So that's the survey of all school numbers. So that's absolutely fine. So I'll expand.
I think it's just a general point about mnemonics. I mean, just putting everything in brackets and sort of saying what like M1 and N2 on the nursery side. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that it would be helpful. I think every trade or profession has its sort of shorthand, isn't it? And I think when you just imbued in it, whereas obviously, and particularly full council, many will not have come across it. But that'd be great.
Thank you, Chair. I'll carry on. So if I jump back to where we were, mathematical development, again, you can see in terms of our outcomes, so the top one is always outcome 5, is always this pattern for all of these. Top graph is the expected level, the bottom graph is the expected level plus 1. You can see there that all of the Monmouthshire schools clustered really quite closely around the line of regression, and many achieving 100%. And you can see again, though, on the regards to the plus 1, those actually really not achieving that red circle that's been highlighted there, that number below the line. And I guess the cause for concern, I guess to a certain extent, is that we're seeing there a number of schools below that line who are very, very low recipients of free school meals. And actually, this piece, which right back at the beginning talks about that search for excellence in terms of ESTIN and so on, you're expecting to see that stretch right across your cohorts. So it's not necessarily just about your FSM children doing better, it's about your MAT children doing much, much better. And that's where you see some of those differentials. But again, at outcome 5, slightly above the region as a whole, and importantly, I think for us, particularly for the particularly for the less disadvantaged, and you can see that there's one school there which is an outlier in that 20 to 30%, and you can see that one there just sitting kind of quite significantly below the line there. But I think the one positive thing to say in terms of all of these scatter graphs is that you can see there's one outlier right to the extreme right-hand side. So they've got very, very high FSM, but they are performing, significantly below the line itself. So we haven't got any of those outliers on that right-hand side. So that's what members should be looking for and trying to understand that. So again, now this one is an interesting one. And this one is, so the measure around personal, social development, well-being and cultural development, which is highlighted and truncated to PSB, is important. You can see there that at the expected level, all of our schools really cling to that line of regression. Some will be a tiny bit under, but that will probably be one pupil in a class kind of thing who don't make that. But you can see then when you go to the expected level plus 1, we're seeing a much, much bigger range of progress in terms of that one. And you're seeing a couple of schools there are towards that left-hand side are right down in terms of their level of performance. So just over the 40% line for 2 there who are in that 0 to 10%. So I think And you can see that on that bullet point on the right-hand side there, a number of schools, particularly in the range of 0 to 20%, where performance is significantly below expectation. So that's an area for us that we need to work on with our schools.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, just very basic. I mean, in terms of outcome 5 and outcome 6, what exactly do you actually mean by those terms? Because I'm not quite sure whether it's a difference in age or whether it's a difference in measuring particular levels. And, you know, what exactly are these outcomes? Thank you.
Okay, so at the end of the foundation phase, which is at the end of year 2, the expectation, which is set, the set expectation by government, is that children will achieve outcome 5. So throughout their time in school, children will be assessed, hopefully in both a formative and a summative way, against their progress around a series of outcomes. And they'll be descriptors, you know, the child can do this, that type of thing. And they'll be making assessments. Now, the majority, the average, is that the expectation that they get to outcome 5. Those children who are more able will achieve an outcome 6. Now, the language changes between foundation phase and key stage 2. When we come to talk around key stage 2, we talk about levels. Foundation phase talks about outcomes. So there's a transition there as we move between the phases. In the select report that you had presented on foundation phase to key stage 3, there was a graphic there that set out the curriculum year, so that's N1 to 13, and what the expectations are of progress between those levels. If it would be helpful for members, then I can put that in. I haven't done so in the past.
Yeah, coming back, I think it would be really, I suppose if there was just a very simple sentence saying something like outcomes 5 and outcomes 6 are sort of what we expect at foundation phase. In later stages, they are called levels of, I don't know whether you'd say a performance or achievement or something of that nature, so that it's a bit more understandable. So really, are you saying sort of outcome 5 is sort of the average and outcome 6 is above? Because in a sense, that would be helpful if there was some sort of grounding on. I mean, I know it's sort of like a noddy guide, but in a sense, if you don't understand what these things mean, then you know, it's helpful to provide an explanation of it, because I wasn't quite sure whether outcome 5 and outcome 6 were based on age levels as opposed to being at the same age, but you know, different sort of levels of performance or achievement or targets or whatever you want to call them. Thank you.
So they are. So that's a judgment at the end of year 2. So every child at the end of their curriculum year 2 has an assessment, and there's a judgment made as to what outcome they're performing at. So the expectation is that children achieve at level 5, so at outcome 5, sorry. For those who are below expectation, they'll be achieving at outcome 4. For those who are achieving ahead of that, they'll be achieving at outcome 6. I don't, you know, there's a significant amount of kind of work that sits behind what that looks like, but I can easily just drop in that graphic, which allows you to see that quite clearly as to where they should be. So that's no problems at all. Okay, so now we move into key stage 2. So this is years 3 to 6. And again, so this is the change now. So we talk about levels. And so for key stage 2 and 3, we talk about levels. And at the end of primary school, so the end of key stage 2, we talk about, so this is our children before they go to secondary. We talk about the expected level. So the top graph is expected level, being expected level 4, and expected level +1 is level 5. So you can see there overall performance. So this is regards to English. Overall performance at level 4 is above the region as a whole, particularly for those schools with less than 20% FSM, so performing strongly there. And you can see with regards to level 5, is also above the region as a whole. However, 2 schools in the FSM range 0 to 30%, where it's below expectation, but not to a significant extent. And you can just pick both of those schools up on the graph there. One is on the 10% line of FSM, and one is probably at about 24, 25%, and they're away from the line of regression. With regard to maths, again, the same. Overall performance at level 4 is above the region as a whole. Again, our schools with low FSM perform particularly well at the expected level. And overall performance at level 5 is also above the region. And again, there are in the range 0 to 30% where performance is below the expectation, with 1 to a significant extent. So you can see that is the one again on 10% just there. And I think what's really useful, if I can just, before I let Councillor Brown come in, is Sharon is going to present after me today, and Sharon's going to talk about the standard and the quality of our schools, school development plans and self-evaluation reports. And I think for you as a select committee, that will be a key area of interest, because I won't name that school in this setting. You will want to take a high level of assurance from the work that Sharon does with the AS that all of our schools know their pupils well, know the activities that will make a difference well, and are implementing those in a timely and effective way. So Sharon's presentation is really timely with regards to this today. Councillor Brown?
Councillor Brown,
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, looking at Key Stage 2 maths level 4 and 5, I just wondered if there was just a sentence to say that level 4 is the average and level 5 is above average, and then it would make it more easy when people were looking at it to see what these charts meant. Thank you.
That's fine. These are just to say, and you know, I've no problem at all, and I think going into full council, that's really wise council. But these are graphs you've had before, so these have all been received and scrutinised by you as a committee. Science, again, you know, the themes are very, very similar, almost identical in actual fact. And again, you can see that there are the odd couple of schools that sit below that line. There's one there at probably 18% and one at about 23% who are getting below. But you can see where other schools are performing in terms of some of theirs, and that's the piece which is useful in these. So we're not reporting an aggregated position, but actually you can see that there are schools with much, much higher levels of FSM. So if we look at science and the expected level +1, so the bottom graph, you'll pick up a school there at, say, high 30s FSM entitlement, yet they're achieving 70% at Key Stage 2 +1. And you wonder, you know, why none of our schools are achieving, many of our schools don't achieve that level, even though they've got much lower FSM. So those are the kind of questions that this type of graph displayed in this way should really help kind of bring out. I go for a slightly different presentation in terms of Key Stage 3, and that's really because there are fewer schools, so it's easier to see. So the narrative didn't feel quite so important, and actually you can probably read the graphs more easily than you could on the previous ones, but I thought the narrative was important. So Key Stage 3. Now, the expected level at the end of year 9 is level 5. So I think it's one thing for members to be aware of is that if we step back into, if we go to English on this one, you will see that if we look to the left-hand side of the bottom graph, there are a significant cluster of our schools where between 50 and 80% of children are already at level 5. But the expected level at the end of year 9 is only level 5. So then when we come across to expected level +1, which is on the right-hand side, that much steeper line of regression, you do wonder, and you know, why actually 80% for that one school with our lowest level of FSM, just under 80% have achieved level 6, but many of our primary schools are reporting English between 50 and 70 at the end of Key Stage 2 at level 5. So in 3 years, the question is, why have they made one level of progress as opposed to a greater level of progress? Rightfully, on the left-hand graph, you would expect given the level of performance at the end of primary, all of our schools to be very, very near that 100% in terms of level 5. No, Councillor Powell.
Councillor Powell, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what the other grammar schools do, but and I'll have to declare an interest because I'm a governor at King Henry. I'll feel something and I'll have to. But we, over this last year or so, we've been working with the cluster primary schools, with our teachers going there and their teaching. Do you find that since that's been happening, when they get to Key Stage 3, that they're in a better place because of the working across that? So the gap isn't so dreadful when you go from primary school to senior school. And, you know, has that shown up?
Absolutely. So I think the projects that you're referring to are between King Henry and its cluster of schools. And what we're seeing there is a concerted effort on the part of all parts of that learning continuum, that they are establishing the right types of skills very early in the primary schools that then allow for a much smoother transition and a continued rate of progress through secondary school. Because what you don't want to happen is for children to be doing really well to the end of Key Stage 2 and transition, which is a huge step. Right? It's important not to dismiss transition as a kind of just moving from one school to another, because for some people it's a huge transition in terms of kind of emotional steps and so on. So inevitably different styles of teaching and so on, there will be some change and some kind of drop off, but actually you're trying to achieve that continuum of progress, and that's really, really important. The other, there are some nice examples of what's happened with regard to maths in the King Henry and Abergavenny cluster, in a sense that there were children in one of our primary schools who were achieving a level 6 at the end of primary school in maths, but the maths teacher or the classroom teacher didn't feel confident in saying, yeah, they're now performing, you know, in a sustained way at that level, but actually having the maths expertise from the secondary school allowed them to do that. And then once you recognise that and model that into the next stage of their education, that's where we can begin to really raise expectations. So if a child is working at level 6 at the end of year 6, then actually you should be very much hoping they should be kind of A-star A's at the end of year 11, you know, assuming that continuum and onwards. And that's where we've got to be challenging in terms of our expectations and really raising the expectations for the whole cohort in the future.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I mean, looking at these charts, I mean, obviously you don't know the names of the schools or anything, but, you know, within the South East Wales area, there are schools that are doing much better in a sense than the level of the FSM would actually suggest. So are they sort of taken as sort of model schools in a sense, and to learn from how they manage to get such good results from? And does the same thing happen in relation to Monmouthshire? Because obviously you'll have comparisons there where some schools are doing well above the line and expected at that particular level, and others that aren't. I mean, I can see there'd be quite a lot of internal work, you know, within Monmouthshire, but I wanted to know how much there was across South East Wales in terms of looking at what they were doing that was so much better to get to these higher than expected levels. Thank you.
There's a huge amount of work across the region. The EAS has established a system called Leading Network Schools, so schools who perform particularly strongly in specific curriculum areas go out, they advise and support other schools in terms of their improving standards. They also have people to the school to see how they work it through in practice. That's this whole development of the new curriculum, this whole development of the new approach to schools, supporting schools, is absolutely predicated on that. So we'd see an awful amount of that, an awful lot of that. And, you know, with really, really significant success. You know, there are schools in Monmouthshire who have challenge advisors and leading network school relationships with very, very high performing schools outside of the county. And it's had a very, very swift and discernible impact on the standards in those schools. And so, yeah, we do benefit from that, absolutely. And as I said earlier, what we're also seeing now is many of our schools becoming leading network schools, and they're going out and supporting other schools as well. And that's what I was talking about, this transition, and really importantly about our schools reaching a position whereby they then become the provider and the contributor, not just the beneficiary.
Councillor Brown.
I mean, I just wondered whether there was more sort of liaison with sort of our near neighbours in terms of Gwent authorities, as opposed to, you know, the whole of the South East Wales region, or, you know, what is it? Is it more Gwent regional work, or is it more South East Wales regional work? Depending, you know, where's the focus and where's the effort there? Thank you.
The focus is very, very much on the work in South East Wales. So in education terms, South East Wales is the former Gwent, the 5 authorities. So that's ourselves, Torfaen, Blaenau Gwent, Newport and Caerphilly. Those 5 authorities are the co-owners. Sorry? They make up South East Wales. They also own the EAS, which is our school improvement. So that's the vehicle for identification and arrangement of many of those support agencies which are brokered between schools. There are times when we do look outside of the region. So, for instance, many of you will be aware the executive head teacher at Caldicot is also the executive head teacher at the Bishop of Llandaff in Cardiff. The challenge advisor in Chepstow School is also the head teacher at Cardiff High School, which is a very, very high-performing school in Cardiff. So we are drawing in you know, a plethora of talents to support all of our schools. The scarcity of scarcity is probably the wrong word. Trying to find that real kind of leading edge performance at secondary prompts us to look outside the region. I think I think all of our secondary performance is not as strength in the AS at the moment. I think that would be fair to say. And there are schools who find themselves in challenging situations. So sometimes that means you have to look outside of the region to find that support. But certainly in primary, it's almost entirely geared around within the AS footprint.
Just a follow-up question. I mean, presumably, is there a lot of liaison between EAS and I think there's a similar equivalent organisation? Is it a central consortium that covers the Cardiff type of area? You know, because obviously that will be important in improving standards as well.
Yes, the four managing directors of GWER, which is the North Regional Consortia, area which exists in the West and Mid Wales, and Central South Consortia, and the AS meet regularly. In fact, not very long ago, probably actually in the period since Christmas, myself and Debbie Hartfelt, who's the chief or the managing director of the AS, gave evidence in the Senedd alongside the managing director and lead director of Central South. So there's a real kind of working together in that. And obviously as directors of education, we meet as 22 and as 5 in South East Wales as well. So there's a lot of collaboration in the area. I am conscious of time.
Yes,
So I'll push on. Really, these, unless there are specific questions, I'll just kind of go through these very quickly. You can see this is the maths one, which is broadly similar. And the way that we'll actually, you'll come on to see how we report on our Key Stage 4 performance. The line becomes increasingly important in terms of how we report that. So there's the maths one, and that is the science as well. So you can see there kind of the numbers above, and you can see the performance. Science being looking like one of our stronger ones, although one of our schools sitting a fair way away from the line and one just below the line. With regards to Key Stage 4, so this is the end of compulsory education, and this is one of those areas which is difficult for us to report on now, because this is all about us moving away from the level 2+, which was the previous kind of gold standard we'd often refer to. So you'll see in the grey writing there on that sub-panel, for every school in Wales, a data pack is produced that compares schools from a similar family. And this is based upon some components: the percentage eligible for free school meals in that school, the percentage living in areas classed in the most 20% deprived areas in Wales, and that's per the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, the percentage with special educational needs, and the percentage whose first language is not English or Welsh. This year, what we're going to report on is the new family of measures that have been announced for this kind of transitionary period of accountability measures. So you'll see there 5 measures: the CAP 9, the literacy point score, so that's the best of English language or English literacy, numeracy, which is best of maths or numeracy, science, which is a single measure, and the Welsh Back Skills Challenge Certificate, which is again a point score. The key one, the consolidated measure, is now the CAP 9, and you can see on the right-hand side that table sets out how that is to be established, the score for CAP 9. So there are 3 slots which are determined. So your literacy, so your best result of either English language or English literature. In other places it will be Welsh language or Welsh literature. We don't have any schools that teach Welsh at secondary, or teach through the medium of Welsh at secondary, I should say. Your best numeracy and your science. So you get that core 3. And then there are 6 slots for other GCSEs or equivalent qualifications. So Qualifications Wales has a database of a whole range of different qualifications that are at level 2. And it's really important that schools pick the right qualifications for students in terms of their own development and their own kind of curriculum pathway. However, there is a risk in this, and this is something which has been identified, is that some schools potentially are using those 6 slots with qualifications that might not be of the same standard. So that is being looked at by Quals Wales at the moment to make sure that people aren't gaming. So all of these changes are to try and find the most accurate and fair reflection of pupils' performance, and also to try and reflect commonality. So there's some conditions around that, but I'll report on where we are at the moment. So again, this is a graph. This is the schools across the South East Wales region, and you can see here that, and this has been presented to you previously. So this is simply, now this isn't on the family of schools, this is on raw FSM. So you can see Monmouthshire is the orange dots again. We have got 1 school significantly above the line. We've got 1 school marginally, well, above the line, just on it, 1 very slightly below it, and 1 just a little bit off as well. And that is on the x-axis, their eligibility for free school meals, and then on the y-axis is their point score. So you can see all of ours sat between that kind of it's broadly around 360 up to 400 was our range of scores this year in the 4 schools. So that picks that up. So the next slide just picks up, now this is comparing like schools. So I've used this from one of our schools' data packs, and really this just expands on that explanation that was on that marker slide. So this is what's in the data pack. So all of the schools in the family, they are orange. The average in the family is the maroon dot, and the school that you're looking at is the blue dot. So you can see this school, and I don't know which one it is. So again, sticking to that, that agreement that we're not naming individual schools, you can see that that school is below the line for its family. And there are some nuances to using the family. So for instance, the families are ranked as in the closest to the furthest away. And so if you're the 10th member of the family, you might not necessarily expect to perform as well as the first member of the family in terms of the challenges that you face. So there are some pieces around that, but actually that line of regression is a really useful piece of a guide for you as members to establish, where is the school? We are comparing to similar schools, and that's a really good measure for that. So that's how we'll be doing that. And This next one really kind of draws it out, I think, quite clearly. And this is, I think, the fairest way I can think of, and I haven't had anybody say it's too explicit or it discloses too much. So I've taken each of the indicators, which I set out as those 5, plus the one more, which is the 5A star to A, which I think is really important for us and our aspirations. And then I've tried to, or I have analysed and said, in each of their families, how many are above the line, how many are on the line, and how many are below the line. And you can see last year, 19, that we had, in too many cases, too many schools below the line. So last year, our schools, secondary school performance at Key Stage 4, although improved on the previous year, compared to their family of schools, so, and remember that's more sophisticated than just FSM, aren't performing as well as we might have hoped. So that's important for us, and it's important for us to remember that in terms of how we report back into council. What I haven't done, and again because of the aggregation, is one of the things which has been well rehearsed in this chamber is the performance of our FSM cohort. Now, when it was reported to you here in Select, you had those tables that the AS put together which showed the differentials. Because it's so apparent, it's not in this or these slides, but in this one, it doesn't take very long to find out which of the schools have got the certain elements eligibility for FSM. So what I haven't done is begun to rank them because it immediately promotes disclosure of which they are. So I'll probably I'll have a chat through with Matt and other colleagues, especially the AS actually, because in terms of, I don't want us to break a line that's being held across the region in terms of how we report that. So it might well be that we end up doing that in a narrative piece rather than a graphic piece. But that's the numbers that sit there, 3 schools below the line for Cap 9, 3 for literacy, 1 for numeracy, 3 again for science, isn't where we need to be. We expect to see that better. Okay, so just a couple of kind of slides which really just try and draw these together. So strengths at foundation phase, expected level +1 is strong. The gender gap is small, as is the FSM gap. That will be below the comparative gap nationally. Key Stage 2, expected level and +1 is good. The gender gap is smaller. The FSM gap is smaller. The progress at the expected level is good. And the progress that EFSM learners make is also in line with expectations. So that's positive as well. Key Stage 3, we've got strong overall performance. The expected level +1 and +2. Now, I don't graphically show +2, so that would be those pupils achieving a level 7, and that's a very good indicator then about high levels of achievement at GCSE. The gender gap is smalling. We saw improved EFSM performance last year. The EFSM gap being the same as Wales at Key Stage 3, and we saw EFSM progress in science and English. And at Key Stage 4, we've seen performance across all the benchmarks will have been above the Welsh performance and against all of the point score indicators. Performance of both boys and girls continues to be above the Wales average. The EFSM gap has closed, and point scores for FSM pupils are increasing from previous years. So even on that slide, I think I need to just reflect a little bit about whether some of those to a Welsh position are comparatives which might be a little bit too explicit. This next one, standards across the system, areas for development in identified schools. So we have a relatively small number of schools, so actually we can talk specifically about individual schools. So at the foundation phase, we know we need to improve the provisional outcome for girls at outcomes 5 and 6. We know we need to improve literacy, language and communication and personal social development outcomes and provision for boys at the higher levels. And we need to improve the progress and outcomes for our FSM learners. At Key Stage 2, we need to accelerate the progress of our FSM learners. And progress is the distance that a child travels between the end of foundation phase and Key Stage 2. And again, and this is common to all of them because I would never want anybody to think we're not continuing that very significant focus on FSM, we need to improve the focus and the progress and the outcomes for FSM learners. And key stage 3, we need to improve the performance for boys at English at the higher levels, and we need to increase the percentage of pupils achieving, this is at key stage 4, achieving 5 A stars and A's, because we're not where we need to be on that one. And we need to improve the progress and the outcomes for FSM learners, closing the gap on the CAP 9 in particular. So there's very clear areas that we need to make progress on. Now, one of the key things which we've also done in terms of recognising where we are as a schooling system is to really kind of triangulate those outcomes, which I've spent far too long talking about, with categorisation outcomes and the ESTIN outcomes. And hopefully these two graphs will kind of really capture that. So on the left-hand side, in 2014, Monmouthshire only had 3 green schools and 2 red schools. By 2020, with the highest number of green primaries, 47%, and a green secondary, 25%. So that's down from last year, from where we had 50% green secondary. 78% of all schools are yellow or green, and there are no red schools in Monmouthshire, which is really positive in terms of the level of support required. And then you can see, if you go over to the next one, the bar charts there, and again, Councillor Brown's point around mnemonics is well made. These are the 5 inspection areas at the bottom, so standards, wellbeing, teaching and learning, care, support and advice, and leadership. And you can see there that we have no unsatisfactory, which is the red. You can see in the middle and the right-hand side of bars. We have some adequate, particularly in the leadership. This is over the last 2 years. But we're seeing growth in terms of the goods. And again, what we're not seeing is a comparable level of excellence compared to the region or compared to Wales. So we know there that those are areas that we need to focus on and to really work hard to step that forward in. So,
can I just clarify, the right-hand graph, is that the different years on there? So
no, that's all ESTIN performance in the last 2 years.
So what is it comparing in those 3 different things?
So the left-hand one is Monmouthshire.
Yeah.
The middle one is the region.
Right.
The right-hand one is Wales.
Okay, you might
Is
want to
that
label
okay?
that.
So I'll set that out.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then the colour block that sits behind the bit on the left, that actually does demonstrate properly the levels of green, etc. So that's all I was going to talk about in terms of outcomes. I've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes. So the next 2 sets are around attendance. Now, attendance, 2 slides. I don't actually think there's very much really that I want to say around attendance. Attendance, both primary and secondary, is very strong, but there is significant narrative around those. However, we probably do just want to dwell on this slide and a slide in 2's time, and that's with regard to exclusions, which are an area of concern for me. And you can see there that whilst at the primary level, we're seeing an increase in the number of days lost per pupil to fixed-term exclusions, and that's not what we want to see. We're seeing an increase in the number of days. It's still lower than it was in 2016-17, but last year it was higher again, so back up to 154. So we're working really closely with our schools to understand what's driving that, and to understand what support they need to actually address that. And for members, not probably now, but later, there is narrative there that sets out some of the actions we're taking in terms of the primary exclusions. With regard to secondary, we've seen significant pressures in terms of secondary, and you can see there a significant step up in terms of the numbers of episodes of fixed-term exclusions in our schools and the number of days lost. Well, actually, yeah, the days lost per episode have remained pretty stable, but the number of days lost in total has increased significantly. So that was a key area of concern for us last year in our focus. Since September, but will be reported in next year's Chief Officer report, we've invested significantly in, we've invested in all of our schools, significantly in 2 of our schools, and then there'll be additional investment as of Easter. As of September, in 2 schools, there was an additional teacher and TA in every school, or in 2 schools, to support with a graduated response to behaviour. In the other 2 schools, there was just a TA. As of return after the Easter holidays, there will be a teacher in those other 2 schools as well. To really try and kind of make sure we smooth that graduated response. So it goes classroom, in school, in reach from the PRU or from a school's own inclusion services, and then the PRU remains our last point in terms of actual behaviour. So that's an investment we've made. We won't see in this data whether that's had an impact in terms of turning the curve, in terms of the level of demand and so on. The other thing, we've had new head teachers, and, it is, I think, probably a truism that new head teachers do like to set their markers down in terms of their expectations of behaviour, and that has led to a slight increase, I think, probably for some of this. But it is an area we know we really got to focus on, and we know we've got to get a grip on. So this will definitely be an area of focus as we move into the next year. I'm happy to take questions on behaviour, but I think we recognise that the impact of the changes we've made since the last time we reported won't be caught in terms of what's happening now. What I could do is that Richard Austin, who he's our Principal Officer for Inclusion, Richard has got a significant amount of information regarding the impact in year of those interventions, and that might be helpful, I think, in terms of just providing some assurance that what we're doing is making a difference.
Councillor Joe.
Absolutely, I understand that we put things in place and we can't see them in these figures. And yes, I think having Richard Austin come along would be very useful, because obviously when we had the EAS business report, that was one of our areas of focus. Yeah. So we really, it's an area we do need to get a hand on, not just in terms of the pupils who are being excluded, but also on that behavioural situation within the classrooms, because it then has a detrimental effect on the other pupils within the classroom to have it going on in those settings. Yeah,
absolutely agree with that. And I think what I'll ask Richard to do, if the committee would like me to, perhaps outside of the Chief Officer's report, is to bring a more detailed report to you, and you'll be then able to understand what drives those exclusions, what the causes are and so on. And the other thing is we can break them down into additional levels, which are those which are 1 to 5 days and then 6 days to 15. And you get a sense of the severity of the incidents that are taking place. Okay, right, I'll do that, of course. So we'll put that into a future agenda. Okay, fine. The one slide that I just wanted to reflect on is this one, which is leadership with regards to, it really recognising the work we've done in the past couple of years to have a significant change in our leadership population. I think it is the key thing that makes a difference in schools. It sets the tone, it sets the culture, it sets the expectations of pupils, staff and parents in terms of how schools are working. We have seen significant turnover in terms of our head teachers. Some for absolutely, the right reasons. People have come to the end of their careers and retired and so on. Some people have moved on to other challenges in other authorities, which is great as well. And some people have left headship because it was the right thing for the school and the children. And we've done that in a really well understood and considered way, I think, across our service working with the EAS. We've seen schools who are schools causing concern, where we've had new head teachers in, and that's made an immediate impact, and we've seen a quicker rate of improvement in those schools than we had seen previously. And as I mentioned right at the outset, we've seen new innovative models of delivery. We've got within our organisation, within our authority, federations now. We've probably got another one to come as well, and that's working really effectively. And we've also got relationships between authorities and between regions, which are also supporting our leadership. So I think leadership work has been a key area of focus for us, and one which has been really effective for us as well. Talking about finances, schools, at the start of the year, we started with a deficit budget of 232,000. That will have seen a significant growth. At the moment, a month 10, internal forecasts suggest that we'll probably be close to 870,000. We might well see that come back in now, actually, I think, a little bit. And we're seeing about 17 schools in a deficit, 4 secondaries, 12 primaries, and the PRU. The PRU is slightly odd. By the time this comes back to council, we might have discounted that because that's actually our service as opposed to a school. So we just need to make sure we classify that properly. Obviously, members will be aware, obviously we've agreed the budget now, we agreed the remits around the loan funding and so on. So that will change as we go into next year in terms of those pictures. But we do absolutely recognise that school finances continue to be a concern. I think it's very positive that we were able to afford schools the £800,000 that was potentially going to be taken off the ISB. I think that is really positive. We also, afforded the extent of the full extent of the pay awards and the pension pressure as well. But it's still a very pressured environment in terms of finances, and we recognise that with our colleagues who work there. And again, looking at the corporate finances, the piece which we hold internally, 3 real drivers to that level of overspend. ALN support for children in school, ALN costs for children out of county, and us not recouping the same level of income from other local authorities as the decision to Mountain House has worked its way through. Sorry?
I'm sorry, but I don't have any sympathy for that, but I won't raise that issue again.
We'll let the Chief Officer finish now.
So I think that's, we recognise what they are. We've accounted for those in the budget as we go forward. So I'm hoping a much closer to budget out next year in terms of those pressures, because they've been accounted for. So in terms of the next period, and taking into account that comment I made earlier about the C-SMART piece, the next period really, we want to look at particularly focus on improving the rates of progress, and particularly those different children's groups. We want our schools to be the very best schools in Wales, and we really need to kind of focus about being above the line. So that's the narrative that you can expect to hear from me much more significantly around about family of school analysis and schools being above the line. We need to make sure that our provision is fit for the future, and that really means us maximising our investment we've made in our SNRBs. And we need to think about that neurodevelopmental group, or that group with neurodevelopmental challenges that we talked about, and that's well traced through the Mountain House papers that we've discussed in the Chamber. We need to help our schools think about their role in the future. The new curriculum will ask many of those questions itself, and we need to think about our response as a local authority to what greater autonomy to curricula means at school level. And I think that's really, really important, and that's a leadership challenge for the local authority. And finally, we've really, really got to drive for excellence. That's, we have lifted the whole system, so that notion around schools receiving 5 goods is really, really positive. We've now got to make sure that we're making that next significant step into achieving excellence in our schools right across all of the provisions for all of our learners. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Will. Before we go into sort of brief questions and comments now, we've picked up a number of issues as we've gone along, sort of conscious of time. And I know that Will needs to get to a leadership, senior leadership meeting. I suggest as well, if we have brief comments or suggestions, that we, if Will has got the time, that we look at the implications that Councillor Joe Watkins raised in terms of school closure, etc. I don't know if you've got the time to do that, but are there any further comments before we, because it is important, and I say we are in very challenging times for everybody, and obviously for schools and for the senior officer, but any comments on the report before we move to the, as it were, the influenza crisis? Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think obviously just to put the comment in context, obviously in terms of reducing income from local authorities in other areas on ALN is a direct impact of the closure of Mountain House School, which, as everyone knows, I wasn't in favour of. But in the next period, it just mentions about improving the rates of progress for ALN in particular, and I just wondered if you could outline how you're going to do that. Thank you.
So, in terms of progress for ALN learners, I think one of the really interesting things as we prepared and presented through our Eston inspection, which is published on the 21st of April, so that will all come out in the due fullness of time, was that our learners who are in our SNRBs make good progress. So we want to really maximise the values that our SNRBs as a system within Monmouthshire can bring to bear on the wider system as well. We are continuing to discuss, and funny enough, I was talking to Dermot McChrystal yesterday, who's the Chief Officer in Torvine, about regional approaches to the very, very high tier needs that exist within our population, and we will continue to do that in collaboration. But we will continue to do that for all of our children. So I think the ALN piece is really about us, as we transition into the new legislation, about us really understand the impact of that and making sure that our schools are prepared for that, because that's a really significant impact on schools in terms of how they are ready for it. I think as well it'd be a really important and a good opportunity for this select committee to have a presentation from Tracy Peed, who's the regional lead on the preparedness for the new legislation, because there will be a significant change for parents. So we've seen a huge increase in the volume of parents requesting statements. That is because at the moment I don't think people have confidence in what an IDP will be and what it will look like in the future. So there's a huge amount of work around ALN. The whole landscape around ALN is changing very, very significantly. So that's why that's there. And we want to make sure that our whole range of ALN learners make that progress. But we do know, as I just said, we've got to present to council before the end of the before the end of the calendar year. We really need to make sure that we are meeting that neurodevelopmental need that we've identified.
Anything else that anyone wants to raise? I obviously, like to thank you, Will, for a very comprehensive report, and obviously you've gone through it in some detail. I'd remind members as well, obviously, of the need to scrutinise, as this report goes, as we go through the year. Also, if there are any sort of further points that will add value before it goes to full council, then obviously we need to sort of, feed those in. Obviously, commend schools with things like attendance, and obviously the schools that are high performing. It does concern me a bit that there are schools there with very low numbers of FSM who are not hitting that, and I know it's a rough and ready reckoner, but it is an indicator of what the cohort is like. And I think that that is an area of concern. Area of concern as well, and I won't go into detail, but is the issue about finance, which does concern people and certainly concerns people living in our wards, and also this issue of exclusion, because obviously if youngsters are not in school, then they're not receiving. They're receiving possibly an alternative education, but it's not quite the same as being in a primary or being in a secondary school. So I think exclusion has got to be fairly top of the agenda, and I think welcome Richard Austin coming in. Shall we move now to looking at sort of contingency, as we're going further into this coronavirus epidemic? I know Councillor Joe Watkins wanted to raise one or two issues, and if you want to answer those, and then obviously I know you need to shoot then.
If I can be really
yeah.
quick. The Sorry, Chair. The first thing to say is that there is a teleconference tomorrow for all 22 directors, so with Welsh Government, so we'll have a very clear position then. We have been, as soon as it became apparent that the coronavirus was going to have a significant impact, we've been communicating continuously with all of our schools. At the start, that was significantly around children returning from foreign travel. So we had numbers of children over the half-term period who were skiing and so on, that type of thing. So we were, you know, at that point, really, it was about following Public Health Wales's advice. That was published and updated on a daily basis as the extent of restrictions in other countries had an impact on what was happening here. So we continue to do that. We've also continued to work with our schools in terms of their preparations around business continuity. So I met with all head teachers last Tuesday, a week ago today, and we talked through the business continuity planning and the various aspects they should be giving consideration to. We've also shared our critical incident plan, which has got very clearly set out template, and also one of our secondary schools offered to share their business continuity plan, which is very well done. So that's been shared amongst all schools. So all schools are now working through those templates and thinking that through. Now, obviously, as of Friday, and again as of yesterday, there have been a significant escalations in terms of that. We are continuing to support schools in conversation and advice in terms of ratios, and that's one of the things which I'm sure we'll be talking to Welsh Government about in terms of teacher to children. I think the announcement that pregnant women should potentially self-isolate, that will be a challenge for some of the schools. And the feedback that I've had this morning already, although not since being in here, has been that we've seen a significant spike in children absent from school and staff absent from school. There is a lot of noise in the system, in social media and so on, about schools closing. At the moment, we are very, very much on the line that is, we will work with Welsh Government to determine a position that is led by government in terms of a decision to close schools. I think at the moment, and watching the announcement yesterday, that is significantly around the impact that that has on other services, and that's really important for us to be have that in our mind. Some of the specifics that you've raised as well, Councillor Watkins, around the provision for free school meals, that's something which I'm talking to my 4 other colleagues in South East Wales about, and that will be a consideration. I think that's been very widely flagged. How's the Parliament, Welsh Government as well, and we'll do that. The exam question is one which is significantly above my pay grade, and that will be one which is determined by the JCQ, the Joint Council for Qualifications. They will be working with all of the examination awarding bodies to work out what happens with regards to examinations and what happens in the summer. Schools, I know, have been working to make sure that children have access to Hub. They've also been using Google Classroom and so on to make sure that there's learning materials accessible, and we're supporting schools in preparing for that. So I think at the moment we're doing all we can, and we're continuing to liaise very closely with our schools. I've been on email with them last night, certainly. The key concerns for us really are around those ratios, that, you know, when it's safe to have children in school, the vulnerable learners piece, examinations and special schools are the kind of the key areas that we're talking through at the moment. As and when anything develops, then obviously we'll make sure that all members are aware of those. Okay.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, just a very quick question. I can understand how it would be easier, for example, for secondary pupils to be learning online. You know, if unfortunately that situation arose, but as opposed to face-to-face classroom situations. But what about contingency planning for the primary schools in terms of you know, making sure that the education of pupils continues throughout the period in some shape or form?
I think the hub provision for primary school children is really good. There's lots of really accessible provision on there for younger children as well. And, you know, clearly we're continuing to work with our all of our schools to make sure that that work is accessible to everybody. Clearly, that point around vulnerable learners around the FSM group, there are pieces around, people having to have the necessary kit to access that learning. That's one of the things which I'm sure will be discussed later on today and as we go into tomorrow as well. So they are significant concerns for us.
Councillor Watt.
One last little point then. I've already been told by supply staff, teachers and teaching assistants, and obviously if our schools shut down, they don't get sick pay, they don't get any of those carry-on pays. It's going to have a massive impact on their income, and they're not directly employed by the local authority. Do we have any idea of what support might be put in place to assist with them at all yet?
No, I don't, I'm afraid, in terms of those people. I think... No, I don't. I think that will probably be picked up later. I'm sure the unions, I think we've had representation from the unions previously around the supply workforce, and that will be a key consideration. I think the broader spread of the economic impact will be. Okay.
The only thing I would say, obviously, thank you very much for the update. I think we've got some clarity now, but obviously parents in our wards are very concerned. And if I had, school-age children now, I would be. But I think the exam area is of huge concern. Obviously, JCQ will probably give guidance on that. But obviously, all the other things are important. But thanks for your time this morning, dear Var. I'll let you go to your meeting. Thank you. Okay. Right, we've now... Just gone 11:30. We'll move now then to obviously welcome Shan Randall-Smith to the meeting, and we'll look at the performance report on school development outcomes.
Good morning. You will have received a report on the quality of school improvement processes. The purpose of the report is to share our evaluation of the quality of those documents in the context of our responsibility as a local authority for raising standards of school performance and how we share effective practice, and then recognising that link between securing these excellent standards in our schools and how that supports improvements for all and ensuring most pupils achieve their potential. So just to summarise, over the past few years in Monmouthshire, we've seen an increasing and an improving trend in our performance in a number of areas. For example, national categorisation. We have far more schools now categorised as green. We don't have any schools categorised as red, but we do still have quite a number that are categorised and needing an amber level of support. We're seeing an improving outcome in recent Estin inspections. So whereas we had a combination of schools who were adequate with some goods, we're now seeing that more schools are having good across the board, and we have seen a small amount of excellence in our schools. But overall, we do need to see more, and we are expecting our schools to be able to identify and show that excellence. It's not saying that there isn't excellence in our schools, but it hasn't been widely recognised yet. So in order to secure this, we are looking at a wider range of measures and a wider range of the work that the schools do in order to see how we can support that movement towards excellence across the system. And that is the basis of the report. School development planning and school self-evaluation are key fundamental areas for schools to be able to think about what they're doing and to secure success. So how well we know ourselves and how honest we are and how well we plan will have a big influence and impact on how well our schools do overall. So whilst they're not the only elements, this is where we're starting, and also we will be coming back to select over the next months or whenever, in order to share other aspects of school performance with you and school positions in that journey of excellence. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have with regard to the report.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was pleased to see on the charts that you know, they've improved from 18, 19 and 2019 to 20, in the sense that we don't have any schools now in the unsatisfactory area, which is a good progress. But I just wondered, there was a comparison with the South East Wales region for 18-19, but there isn't one for 19-20 to see how we're doing in comparison with those. And then the second question, I'm trying not to ask too many questions at once, is basically, if it's a self-evaluation, which is, I think, what you mentioned, how can you make sure that the self-evaluation is of the same standard? You know, for example, I might feel that my school is absolutely excellent, but somebody else may feel it's unsatisfactory. You know, so how do you level up and make sure that there's a certain standard level if it's a self-evaluation as opposed to an STIN inspection, for example?
Thank you for your questions. The data regionally for 2019-20 is not available, but when it does become available, we will obviously update the report and, you know, we will share that with you. So we wanted to share our own school's progress in this area as soon as we possibly could. And as I say, we may well have that information in the near future. So moving on to your second question, the quality of the school development planning and self-evaluation processes, as you know, there's no requirement now for schools to write a self-evaluation report, but it's the quality of the processes that they have in schools to give them accurate judgments are evaluated through the challenge advisor visits. So over the year, challenge advisors will work alongside schools to moderate the work that they do. So for example, if there's a learning walk, the challenge advisor may well be involved in that. They may well look at the moderation of head teachers' judgments or senior leaders' judgments on school teaching observations, but they'll compare those with book scrutinies and listening to learners, so that the judgment overall is the judgment of the challenge advisor based on the very rich evidence base provided by the schools, and that is moderated and developed during the year.
Brown.
Yeah, so taking that into account, for example, if a school self-evaluated as good and EAS thought it was adequate, what would happen in terms of you know, the level of assessment? From what I appreciate that they work hand in hand, but I'm not quite clear who, in a sense, is the external monitor of the standard levels.
So the national categorisation process is used as really a summary, a point in time as to where the school is. So the information that's collected by the challenge advisor feeds into that report, and the information from the national categorisation report will reflect the quality of self-evaluation processes that we've used here. So it has been through a process itself. Obviously, STIN will come to a school and look at it in a snapshot in time and not necessarily focus on absolutely everything in this current model. So there is a degree of assurance from our point of view that the judgments that we're looking at here are made by the challenge advisor based on what they've seen and worked on within the school, and that will then be moderated within EAS through their discussions with their principal challenge advisor in order to make sure that there's consistency amongst that team as well. Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Joe Watkins.
Thank you. So obviously looking at the 1920 graph, it's great that there aren't any unsatisfactory in those columns, and only a small amount which is classed as adequate as well. Obviously the vast majority is in good, and we've talked already earlier on today with Will about the need to drive for excellence. What sorts of things are going to be put in place to help schools drive towards excellence?
So looking at this particular aspect of work, last year we put in a regional protocol for looking at school development planning. So schools were invited to attend workshop sessions, and they were really well attended by Monmouthshire schools. We then had school development plan surgeries within Monmouthshire, where all of our secondary schools came in to visit us, and we went through their plans with them, offered some advice, identified particular support. As a result of that, there was additional challenge advisor support in areas to help schools. And we also identified all of our schools causing concern, our amber level of support schools, to discuss their plans with them as well. In the autumn term, we then met formally with all of our secondary schools. We reviewed the plans again. And again, if there was any further work needed or any additional amendments, that was shared with schools. And we looked and scrutinised schools causing concern plans with them in our meetings in the autumn term. All schools are able to access support, and challenge advisors are aware of where those areas of strength are, but areas where schools need to work towards. So the correlation between the self-evaluation processes in schools and their single plan and their school development plan will have been discussed and modified as a result of their work with challenge advisors.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think the charts that show all schools, but from the previous report that we've had today on the annual report, it seems as if the secondary schools aren't doing as well as the primary schools. And I was just wondering whether it would be better to have also broken down the graphs to show, I mean, I know we've only got 4 secondary schools, but, adequate, good and excellent. From this graph, we don't know. My guess is that more of the primary schools are in the good, excellent than the secondary schools. But again, if we had graphs showing the comparison, it may highlight the need to do more work with the secondary schools, I suspect, because at the moment it does actually perhaps present a more rosy picture, because you're just looking, you're sort of glossing over, in a sense, the primary schools are bringing up the secondary schools across the graph, as opposed to that. And I think it would be helpful if there was a breakdown, and then sort of, in terms of, and then we could see, for example, how our secondary schools and our primary schools compare to the South East Wales region, which we haven't actually got at the moment. And I'm just a bit concerned that it may present a much better picture than the underlying picture is in terms of the difference between the primary and the secondary schools. Thank you.
You are quite right. We just have 4 secondary schools, and the regional picture will have a lot more. However, certainly within our 4 primary schools, 2 of the original plans that were submitted to us in the scrutiny session were returned to the schools for further update. But they are all adequate or better now. We do have excellent plans, and we have some good plans and inadequate, but they are all fit for purpose and meet statutory requirements. We can break it down for the future, and would be happy to do that. But as I said, when you just have 4, it is quite a small amount. But we'll take that on board for the next time we update the report for you.
Any other issues or comments? Obviously, I'd like to thank Sharon Randall-Smith for coming in today. Obviously, I'd like to add, it's good and summing up that we've all the schools now are in the good categories. There are none in red. I think it does concern me a bit in terms of, we only have 4 secondaries. I think only 1 is in green at the moment, and it does appear that secondary schools in one way, and they're much they are large organisations, you know, large numbers of staff, pupils, etc. But it's almost like trying to move steer the Titanic. It seems to be more difficult to move secondary schools purely because of volume of staff, whereas primary schools, smaller staffs, etc. And if they are slipping down the sort of colour-coded system, it does appear to be easier to move them, you know, back up. But you know, obviously secondary, like primary, is such an important phase in terms of external exams. And I would like to see any, you know, ideally, I'm sure the committee would like an improvement in secondary performance in the ones that have slightly slipped down. But say thanks to Sharon Randall-Smith today for coming to the meeting. It's obviously an important area in terms of school performance, in terms of the development of staff and the input from EAS. But thanks for coming today. Now then, we move to the next agenda item to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. Any issues on? No? People are happy for me to sign them off? Yeah. In terms, okay, that's item 6. Item 7, the Select Committee Forward Work Plan. More for information, really. We'll obviously have, I think, invite Richard Austin in to look at the issue of exclusion, with, you know, because that is important. We've got a number of other issues that we will be looking at that are listed under the school items, and I think it's important. You know, we're working today in somewhat strange times, but it's important, I think, in the future to try to push as well to have more input from schools into this committee, so that people can come in, you know, in terms of some of the issues that are affecting schools. So I personally, I would like to be pressing on that. One that I'm very concerned about is a loss of pupils to other schools. You know, if you particularly look at Chepstow with YD, and if you look at Abergavenny with children going to Crickhowell, I know that's been less. No, I agree. No, I agree. But you know, my feeling, and I'm sure it's the feeling of this committee, is that if pupils receive their primary education within this authority, then hopefully you would want to retain as many as you possibly can. Yeah, I think this is where the cluster working is. Could you put your microphone on, Maureen, please? Yeah. Cluster
working is helping because, particularly with Goitra, we were the ones that we were losing from Goitra over the border now. There's more of them coming in September now to us than was previously because of the cluster working, because they're familiar with it, and I think that has helped a bit. But I'm afraid you always do get a little bit of this. It's I don't know why, but it's just parents get an idea, and very often.
Thank you, Councillor Maureen Powell. I take your point. Any other thing on the future work plan? Councillor Brown.
Yeah, on the 28th of April, it says additional learning needs update, performance report on additional learning needs strategy. I would like some inclusion on, you know, what's happening to the existing pupils for Mountain House School to be included in that, to make sure that you know, there is a good outcome for them in terms of their alternative schooling arrangements, which you know, which I do keep asking for, and I don't seem to get any information back on. The other issue that I am interested in terms of the development of the it says progress on curriculum reform. I think in terms of actually asking schools to come here who've been pilot schools for the new curriculum would be helpful for primary and secondary. And again, that's something that I've been asking for on a number of occasions. I believe even in the Constitution, a member is entitled to ask for reports on particular matters, you know, the Monmouthshire County Council constitution, and I've asked for those two particular things on a number of occasions, you know, in council meetings, in these meetings, and I do not seem to be getting any response on that. Thank you.
Well, yeah.
Are those items that the committee wish to add to the work programme?
Yes, I would say yes. Yeah. I've got to say as well, you know, it's probably my personal interest in some ways, but an update on Welsh Medium, particularly where the new school, which Welsh Government is funding, you know, what's happening there, because there are a number of people now asking me about that, but I appreciate in the current circumstances that might be slightly pushed back. Thanks for those comments. I think that's useful in terms of guiding our future work program. You know, there are certainly plenty of things on there that we need to address. And we'll take those into account in terms of the next agenda. The Council and Cabinet work plan really is a point of information as much as anything. The next meeting will be Tuesday the 28th of April at 10 o'clock, obviously subject to what, you know, seriously develops in the next few weeks in terms of the coronavirus. But thanks for all your time and efforts this morning, and thanks for coming. Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because we did have an amendment to the constitution to allow sort of members to participate sort of online, as it were, and I just wondered whether that should be something to be looked at in terms of, I don't know whether it's through Skype or what, but it might be something that, so that you know, things don't grind to a full halt. It might be possible to have you know, look at the technology for democratic services, so that I think that is part of possibly the internal contingency planning, you know, through democratic services and so forth, that perhaps needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think Councillor Brown raises a very good point. Just to give a sort of brief update on that. Of course, as members, as you're aware, the Constitution was changed some time ago to allow for remote attendance, to enable a certain proportion of meeting attendees to attend remotely. Well, the constitutional change has been made, as you've highlighted, Councillor Brown. We do still have some technology limitations on that, particularly within the chamber, because if you think of a council meeting as an example, members attending remotely have to be visible to the chair, to be visible to all members in the chamber. At the moment, our current technology has limitations. We did have one instance where Councillor Greenland attended remotely at council. If you recall, he was almost sort of perched on a sort of portable television on the end of the bench. So there's still some work to be done to enable that constitutional permission you've given to be enacted with the technology. We do have some money in the capital programme to progress that, but it's not going to be there in time for us to deal with the current situation, because quite a bit of work is needed.
Yeah, I didn't realise it was a proportionate you know, number of members as opposed to yeah. Okay, and I suppose you've got these technological things to combat. Is that right?
That's right. But what I would say, and there'll be other conversations happening about this in the coming weeks and days, these are exceptional circumstances, and we will have to look at those, have discussions with members to actually determine how we can effectively keep the council running in the event that members are not able to attend this building for meetings. So absolutely a really important question to raise at the time, not one I can give a full sort of response on, but we will be updating members as positions change, and should any sort of variations be needed to arrangements for political meetings, we'll ensure to brief all members on those.
You know, just as an added thing, I got notification that the Fire Authority was deferring all of its meetings for some time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Matt, for that update. That is a very valid point, but as Matt said, I can see the difficulties. If one or two members didn't want to attend for whatever health reasons, but obviously, 43, the technology of that is going to be difficult. Thanks for your time today. I hope you keep well, as I hope the rest of us do. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.